In the rugged mountains of Colorado Territory, where silver mines carved fortunes from stone and cattle ranches sprawled across endless valleys, a young woman's fate hung in the balance like morning mist over Copper Creek. Elena Martinez stood, trembling in her family's modest boarding house, wearing a wedding dress that felt more like a funeral shroud, knowing that in mere hours she would belong to a man whose cruelty was whispered about in every corner of town. But destiny has a way of wearing unexpected faces, and sometimes salvation comes in the form of a giant cowboy whose gentle heart beats beneath shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of another's broken world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden floors of the Martinez boarding house as Elena pressed her face against the cool window glass, watching the bustling preparations in Copper Creek's main street below. Merchants hung colorful banners from their storefronts, and even the Silver Dollar Saloon had swept its front steps clean in honor of what the town considered the social event of the season. Today, Elena Martinez would marry Roderick Blackwood, heir to the largest silver mining fortune in 3 counties, and everyone in Copper Creek seemed determined to celebrate what they saw as a fairy tale romance. Elena knew better. This was no fairy tale, but a business transaction wrapped in white silk and sealed with vows that would taste like ash in her mouth. She touched the delicate lace of her wedding dress, a creation that had cost more than her family's boarding house earned in 6 months. Roderick had insisted on commissioning it from Denver, claiming that his bride must look the part of a mining heiress, even if she was nothing more than the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had built their modest life one paying guest at a time. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, with its layers of imported French lace and tiny pearl buttons that caught the morning light like dewdrops. But beauty meant nothing when it adorned a sacrifice. Elena had seen the bruises on the arms of Roderick's previous conquests, had heard the servants whisper about his violent temper when crossed. She had watched him strike a stable boy for not moving quickly enough, had seen the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes when he looked at her as if she were livestock being appraised for purchase. Victoria Martinez bustled into the room carrying a tray of coffee and sweet bread, her usually warm face pinched with the strain of the past months. Elena's mother had aged visibly since the mining accident that left Elena's father with a crushed leg and mounting medical bills. The boarding house, once their pride and independence, now teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, and Roderick Blackwood had appeared like an answer to prayer, offering to pay all their debts and provide for the family in exchange for Elena's hand. In marriage, Mija, you must eat something, Victoria said, setting the tray on the small wooden table by the window. It's going to be a long day, and you need your strength. Elena turned from the window, her dark eyes reflecting a resignation that broke her mother's heart. Mama, I can't do this. There has to be another way. We could sell the boarding house, move somewhere else, start over. Victoria's hands stilled on the coffee cup she was pouring. For a moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing the desperate woman beneath. And go where, Elena? Do what? Your papa can barely walk, and I'm not young anymore. The debts are too much. Without this marriage, we lose everything, and your papa doesn't survive another winter in the cold. The weight of her family's survival pressed down on Elena's shoulders like a physical force. She understood the mathematics of their situation with brutal clarity. Roderick's offer was generous enough to pay off their debts, ensure proper medical care for her father, and provide a comfortable future for her parents. All it cost was Elena's freedom, her dreams, and quite possibly her life, given Roderick's reputation for violence against those who could not fight back. I've heard the stories, Mama, Elena whispered, sinking into the chair beside the window. About what he does to women who displease him. About the servant girl who disappeared last winter after she refused his advances. Victoria's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. Those are just rumors, Mija. People in small towns love to gossip. Senor Blackwood is from a good family. He'll treat you well. Both women knew it was a lie, but it was the lie they needed to tell themselves to survive the next few hours. Elena picked at the sweet bread without appetite, watching through the window as workers finished hanging bunting across the street. The entire town would attend the wedding at St. Mary's Chapel, not out of affection for the bride and groom, but because Roderick Blackwood's wealth commanded their presence. He owned half the businesses in Copper Creek, either directly or through the debts they owed him. A commotion in the street below caught Elena's attention. A massive figure on horseback was making its way down the main road, and people were stepping aside to give him passage. Even from her second-story window, Elena could see that this was no ordinary man. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, but his sheer size was remarkable. His shoulders seemed to span half the width of his mount, and when he dismounted outside the general store, he towered over every other person on the street. "Who is that?" Elena asked, her attention momentarily distracted from her own troubles. Victoria joined her at the window, following her daughter's gaze. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's Samuel Garrett. He owns the big cattle ranch up in the valley. Keeps to himself mostly, especially since his wife died a few years back. She studied the giant figure as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Good man, from what I hear. Pays his bills on time, treats his workers fair. But he's got a reputation for being fierce when roused. They say he killed 3 men in the war with his bare hands. Elena watched as Sam Garrett moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man, carefully stepping around a small child who had dropped a toy in his path. He bent down, picked up the wooden horse, and handed it back to the boy with what appeared to be a kind word. The contrast between his intimidating size and his gentle action struck Elena as remarkable. "He doesn't look fierce," she observed, noting how he removed his hat when greeting Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, his manners those of a gentleman despite his rough work clothes. "Still waters run deep, Mija," Victoria replied. "Men like that, they don't show their strength until they need to. But when they do—" She left the sentence unfinished, turning back to the breakfast tray. "Enough daydreaming. We need to finish your preparations." As her mother began laying out the various accessories that would complete her bridal ensemble, Elena found her gaze drawn back to the tall figure of Samuel Garrett. There was something about his presence that seemed to command respect without demanding it, a quiet dignity that reminded her of her grandfather, a man who had faced hardship with unwavering integrity. She wondered what it would be like to be married to a man who treated others with such evident consideration, then quickly pushed the thought away. Such wondering was pointless now. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Rosa Delgado, the local seamstress and midwife, arrived to help Elena with her hair and makeup, chattering nervously about the wedding as if her bright words could somehow lighten the oppressive atmosphere in the room. Elena submitted to their ministrations with the passive acceptance of a condemned prisoner, saying little as they transformed her into the vision of bridal perfection that Roderick demanded. By noon, the boarding house had filled with guests who had come to escort the bride to the church. Elena recognized most of them as business associates of Roderick's, their congratulations hollow and their smiles forced. These were people who understood the true nature of this union but chose to pretend otherwise for the sake of social convention and business relationships. Elena's father, Diego Martinez, made his painful way up the stairs to see his daughter before they left for the church. The mining accident had left him permanently injured, and each step was an effort that he tried to hide behind a forced smile. When he saw Elena in her wedding dress, tears gathered in his weathered eyes. "Forgive me, Mija," he whispered, taking her hands in his calloused palms. "If I were a stronger man, a better provider, you wouldn't have to sacrifice your happiness for our mistakes." Elena squeezed her father's hands, drawing strength from his love even in her darkest hour. "Papa, this is not your fault. Life is hard sometimes, and we do what we must for family. I understand." But understanding and accepting were two different things, and as they made their way through the crowded boarding house toward the waiting carriages, Elena felt as if she were walking to her own execution. The white dress that should have been a symbol of joy and new beginnings felt instead like a shroud, beautiful but ultimately meant to cover something that was dying. The ride to St. Mary's Chapel was mercifully short, but Elena was acutely aware of every detail. The way the autumn sun slanted through the carriage windows, the sound of the horse's hooves on the packed dirt road, the nervous way her mother smooth her own skirts. These might be among the last moments of her life when she could think her own thoughts, make her own choices, even if those choices were limited to where to direct her gaze or how to arrange her hands in her lap. St. Mary's Chapel stood at the end of Copper Creek's Main Street, a modest wooden building that served the spiritual needs of the growing community. Today, it was decorated with late-season wildflowers and white ribbons, transforming it into something that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Elena could see the crowd of wedding guests already assembled outside the church, their fine clothes a stark contrast to the simple frontier setting. As her carriage pulled up to the chapel steps, Elena caught sight of Roderick Blackwood waiting near the church entrance. Even from a distance, his presence filled her with dread. He was a handsome man in a cold, aristocratic way, with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive Eastern clothes that marked him as someone who believed himself above the rough frontier life of Copper Creek. But Elena had seen beneath that polished exterior to the cruelty that lay underneath, and she knew that this marriage would be a form of legalized captivity. Roderick's pale blue eyes fixed on her carriage with the intensity of a predator watching prey, and Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. In a few short hours, she would belong to this man completely, subject to his will, and his temper with no legal recourse and no escape. The thought made her stomach clench with fear and revulsion. As she stepped down from the carriage, Elena's legs felt unsteady beneath her. The elaborate wedding dress that Roderick had insisted upon suddenly felt like a costume in a play she had never wanted to perform in. The gathered crowd turned to look at her with a mixture of admiration for her beauty and sympathy for her obvious distress, though none of them would dare to interfere with Roderick Blackwood's plans. Elena's mother took her arm, offering what support she could, but Elena could feel Victoria trembling with her own emotions. This was not the wedding day that any mother dreamed of for her daughter, and the knowledge that she was complicit in Elena's sacrifice weighed heavily on Victoria's conscience. "Smile, Mija," Victoria whispered urgently as they approached the chapel steps. "People are watching." Elena managed a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes, but she knew that everyone present could see through the facade. This was not a celebration of love, but a transaction disguised as a sacrament, and the pretense fooled no one, least of all the bride herself. As they reached the chapel entrance, Roderick stepped forward to greet his bride. His smile was perfectly practiced, designed to project the image of a devoted groom. But when he took Elena's hand, his grip was possessive and slightly painful, a preview of the control he intended to exercise over every aspect of her life. "My beautiful bride," he said loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear, but his eyes held a coldness that made Elena's blood freeze. "You look absolutely perfect." Elena managed to nod in response, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Roderick's hand on her arm felt like a shackle, and she could smell the expensive cologne he wore, a scent that would forever be associated in her mind with fear and unwanted possession. As they prepared to enter the church where Father Miguel waited to perform the ceremony that would seal her fate, Elena cast one last desperate glance around the assembled crowd, hoping against hope for some kind of intervention, some miracle that might yet save her from the life of misery that stretched ahead. That was when she saw him again. Samuel Garrett stood at the edge of the crowd, his massive frame unmistakable even among the many guests. Unlike the others, who watched the proceedings with the detached interest of spectators at a social event, Sam's dark eyes were fixed on Elena with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her terrified soul. For just a moment, their gazes met across the crowd, and Elena felt something pass between them, a recognition of her distress that no one else seemed willing or able to acknowledge. But then Roderick's grip on her arm tightened, and he guided her up the chapel steps and through the heavy wooden doors, away from the autumn sunlight and into the dim interior where her future waited like a prison sentence dressed up in holy words and sacred vows. The interior of St. Mary's Chapel felt suffocating despite its modest size, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and beeswax candles that flickered in the autumn breeze filtering through the open windows. Elena moved down the narrow aisle like a woman walking through a nightmare, each step taking her closer to a future that filled her with dread. The wooden pews were packed with guests whose faces blurred together in her peripheral vision, their whispered conversations creating a low hum that seemed to echo the buzzing of anxiety in her own mind. Father Miguel stood at the simple wooden altar, his weathered face grave with the knowledge of what this ceremony truly represented. The elderly priest had baptized Elena as an infant and watched her grow into a spirited young woman with dreams of teaching children and perhaps finding love with someone who would cherish her independence. Now he was being asked to perform a marriage that everyone present knew was built on desperation rather than affection, and the weight of that knowledge showed in every line of his aging face. Roderick's grip on Elena's arm never loosened as they approached the altar, his fingers pressing into her flesh with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. She could feel his satisfaction radiating from him like heat from a forge, the pleasure he took in finally acquiring what he considered to be his rightful prize. To him, Elena represented not just a beautiful wife, but a symbol of his power over the people of Copper Creek, proof that even the most reluctant could be forced to bend to his will through the application of sufficient pressure. As they reached the altar, Elena caught sight of her parents in the front pew, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and resigned acceptance. Her father leaned heavily on his walking stick, the injury from the mining accident having left him permanently weakened, while her mother clutched a handkerchief in hands that trembled with barely suppressed emotion. They had dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion, but no amount of finery could disguise the fact that they were attending what felt more like a funeral than a wedding. Father Miguel opened his worn prayer book and began the traditional words of the marriage ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel. Elena tried to focus on the familiar Latin phrases, seeking comfort in their ancient rhythm, but her mind kept wandering to thoughts of escape that she knew were impossible. There was nowhere to run, no one to turn to, and even if she could somehow flee, the consequences for her family would be devastating. Dearly beloved, Father Miguel continued in English, his eyes meeting Elena's with a compassion that brought tears to her own. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Roderick Blackwood and Elena Martinez in holy matrimony. Elena felt a strange detachment settle over her, as if she were watching these proceedings happen to someone else. The woman in the beautiful white dress standing beside Roderick Blackwood could not possibly be her, could not be the same person who had once dreamed of adventure and independence. That Elena had died sometime during the long months of financial desperation and impossible choices, replaced by this hollow version who moved and spoke as required but felt nothing beyond a numbing acceptance of her fate. The chapel door creaked softly as someone entered late, but Elena did not turn to see who it was. Nothing could change what was happening here. Nothing could alter the course that had been set in motion by circumstances beyond her control. She was dimly aware of movement in the back of the church, of whispered conversations and shuffling feet, but these seemed to belong to another world entirely. Roderick squeezed her hand, a gesture that might have appeared affectionate to the assembled guests, but which Elena recognized as a warning to maintain her composure. His pale blue eyes held a coldness that promised retribution for any public display of reluctance, and Elena had already seen enough examples of his cruelty to know that such threats were not idle. She forced herself to stand straighter, to project the image of a willing bride, even as everything inside her screamed in protest. If anyone here present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, Father Miguel intoned, following the traditional formula despite knowing that no one would dare to speak against Roderick Blackwood's wishes, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the chapel windows and the distant sound of horses moving restlessly outside. Elena closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer to whatever saints might be listening for the strength to endure what lay ahead. When she opened them again, she found herself looking directly at Samuel Garrett, who had somehow moved closer to the front of the church during the ceremony. The giant cowboy's dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to burn through all pretense and social convention. Unlike the other guests, who watched the proceedings with polite interest or barely concealed discomfort, Sam's gaze held something Elena had not expected to see: recognition of her suffering and a kind of quiet outrage that someone would be forced into such circumstances. For a moment, their eyes held across the space between them, and Elena felt as if he could see straight through to her terrified soul. Something shifted in Sam's expression, a hardening of his features that transformed him from a gentle giant into something far more dangerous. Elena saw his massive hands clench into fists at his sides, saw the way his jaw tightened with suppressed anger. The sight filled her with an unexpected flicker of hope, though she could not have said why. This man was a stranger to her, someone she had only glimpsed from her window that morning, yet something in his bearing suggested that he understood the true nature of what was happening here. Father Miguel cleared his throat, clearly hoping to move the ceremony along without incident. The priest had seen enough of life to recognize the signs of an unwilling bride, but he also understood the practical realities that had led to this moment. The Martinez family faced financial ruin without this marriage, and interfering would only delay the inevitable while making their situation worse. Roderick Blackwood, the priest continued, do you take Elena Martinez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Roderick's response was immediate and confident, delivered with the satisfaction of a man claiming a prize he had worked hard to obtain. I do. The words hit Elena like physical blows, each syllable sealing her fate a little more completely. She felt as if she were drowning in plain sight of 100 witnesses, none of whom would reach out to save her. The elaborate wedding dress that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt like a burial shroud, its white lace mocking the traditional symbolism of purity and new beginnings. Elena Martinez, Father Miguel said, his voice gentler now as he turned to address the bride. Do you take Roderick Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Elena opened her mouth to speak, knowing that she had no choice but to voice the lie that would bind her to a lifetime of misery. The word yes formed on her lips, required by duty and family obligation, even as every fiber of her being rebelled against speaking it. Time seemed to slow as she prepared to sacrifice herself on the altar of financial necessity, her dreams and hopes crumbling like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. But before she could force the words out, a deep voice spoke from the back of the chapel, cutting through the hushed atmosphere like a blade through silk. No. The single word, spoken with quiet authority, brought the entire ceremony to a halt. Every head in the chapel turned toward the source of the interruption, gasps and murmurs rippling through the assembled guests like stones thrown into still water. Elena felt her heart stop as she saw Samuel Garrett standing in the center aisle, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire space as he faced down the shocked crowd. Roderick's grip on Elena's hand became painful as his face flushed with rage. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his cultured voice cracking with fury. Who dares to interrupt my wedding? Sam took a step forward, his spurs ringing softly against the wooden floor. Despite his size and obvious strength, his movements were controlled and deliberate, like those of a man who understood the weight of his own power and chose to use it carefully. Samuel Garrett, he said simply, his voice carrying easily through the chapel. And I'm here because this woman doesn't want to marry you. The gasps from the assembled guests grew louder, and Elena saw her mother's face go pale with terror. Everyone in Copper Creek knew that opposing Roderick Blackwood was financial suicide, and now this stranger was openly challenging him in front of the entire town. Elena wanted to speak, to tell Sam that his intervention, while brave, would only make things worse for everyone involved, but the words stuck in her throat. Roderick released Elena's hand and stepped toward Sam, his pale eyes blazing with a fury that made Elena's blood run cold. You have no right to interfere in matters that don't concern you, Cowboy. This woman is here of her own free will. Sam's laugh was without humor, a sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in his chest. Free will? He gestured toward Elena, who stood frozen at the altar. Look at her face and tell me again about free will. Elena felt every eye in the chapel turn toward her, and she knew that her expression must reveal everything she had been trying to hide. The fear, the desperation, the complete absence of joy that should have characterized a bride on her wedding day were written clearly on her features for anyone with the courage to see them. This is preposterous, Roderick sputtered, but Elena could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. He had counted on the social pressure of the public ceremony to ensure that no one would interfere with his plans, but now he found himself confronted by someone who seemed immune to such considerations. Sam took another step forward, and Elena noticed that several of Roderick's business associates had begun to edge toward the exits. The giant cowboy's reputation for violence when roused was evidently well known, and none of them seemed eager to test whether the stories were true. "The lady can speak for herself," Sam said, his eyes never leaving Roderick's face. "If she wants to marry you, she can say so, but I'm thinking she might prefer to have some other options." Father Miguel looked back and forth between the two, men like a referee at a boxing match, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that had moved far beyond the bounds of normal wedding protocol. The elderly priest had performed hundreds of marriage ceremonies over his decades of service, but none had ever been interrupted by a challenge that threatened to turn violent at any moment. Elena found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I." She looked at her parents, seeing the terror in their eyes as they contemplated the consequences of defying Roderick's will. She thought of her father's medical bills, of the boarding house that provided their only income, of the debts that would crush her family if this marriage did not proceed as planned. But then she looked at Sam Garrett, this stranger who had risked his own safety to give her a choice that no one else had been willing to offer. His dark eyes held a steadiness that reminded her of mountains, unchanging and reliable, and for the first time in months, Elena felt as if someone saw her as more than a commodity to be traded for financial advantage. "I don't want this," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I never wanted this." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, its implications spreading through the assembled crowd in waves of shock and speculation. Elena's mother made a sound of distress, while her father closed his eyes as if preparing for a blow. They all understood that Elena's words had just changed everything, though none of them could yet see how the situation might resolve itself. Roderick's face had gone from red to white, his fury now mixed with something that might have been fear. He was accustomed to having his will obeyed without question, and the public nature of this defiance threatened to undermine his carefully cultivated image of control. "You little fool," he hissed at Elena, his mask of gentlemanly behavior finally slipping completely. "You have no idea what you've just done to your family." Sam moved with surprising speed for such a large man, interposing himself between Roderick and Elena before the mining heir could take another step toward the altar. "I think the lady has been clear enough," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made several guests instinctively move toward the exits. "The question now is what happens next." Elena's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what she had just done. By refusing to complete the marriage ceremony, she had condemned her family to financial ruin and her father to medical care they could not afford. But she had also reclaimed something precious that she had thought lost forever, the right to choose her own path, even if that path led to hardship and uncertainty. Roderick seemed to gather himself, straightening his expensive suit jacket and attempting to regain his composure. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You cannot simply walk away from agreements that have already been made. There are contracts, obligations that must be honored." "What kind of contracts?" Sam asked, his tone deceptively casual. Elena saw her father struggle to his feet, leaning heavily on his walking stick as he prepared to face the consequences of his daughter's decision. "Senor Blackwood paid our debts," Diego said, his voice heavy with shame and resignation. "The medical bills, the mortgage on the boarding house, in exchange for marriage to Elena." Sam's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. "So you bought her," he said to Roderick, the contempt in his voice making the other man flinch. "Like livestock at auction." "It was a business arrangement," Roderick replied defensively, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Perfectly legal and beneficial to all parties involved." Elena felt tears of rage and humiliation burning in her eyes. To hear her sacrifice reduced to the terms of a business transaction was almost more than she could bear, but it also crystallized her resolve. Whatever the consequences, she would not allow herself to be treated as property to be bought and sold. Sam reached into his jacket, producing a leather wallet that had seen years of use. "How much?" he asked simply. Roderick blinked in confusion. "How much what? How much did you pay for her family's debts?" "I'll match it," plus interest for your trouble. The offer hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap, generating a buzz of whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. Elena stared at Sam in amazement, unable to comprehend why a stranger would make such a generous gesture on her behalf. The amount Roderick had paid to secure her hand in marriage represented more money than most people in Copper Creek would see in a lifetime. Roderick's eyes narrowed as he studied Sam with new attention. And what exactly would you want in return for such a charitable contribution? Sam's answer was directed not to Roderick, but to Elena, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. Nothing that isn't freely given, he said quietly. A woman should have the right to choose her own future. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that spread through her body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, was offering her something that no one else ever had: true freedom to make her own choices without coercion or manipulation. But even as hope began to bloom in her heart, Elena understood the practical realities of the situation. "I cannot accept such generosity," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "I have no way to repay such a debt." Sam's smile was gentle, transforming his weathered features in a way that made Elena's breath catch. "Who said anything about debt? Sometimes a person does something because it's right, not because they expect payment." Father Miguel, who had been watching these proceedings with growing amazement, finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private setting," he suggested diplomatically. "The chapel is meant for worship, not financial negotiations." But Roderick was far from finished. His initial shock at Sam's interference had given way to a cold calculation that Elena recognized as far more dangerous than his earlier fury. "You think you can simply buy your way into this situation, Cowboy? Elena Martinez belongs to me, legally and morally. Her family accepted my money in good faith, and I intend to collect on that investment." The way Roderick spoke about her, as if she were property whose ownership was being disputed, filled Elena with a rage that burned away her fear. "I belong to no one," she said, her voice ringing clearly through the chapel. "I am not a possession to be bought or sold or collected upon." Sam nodded approvingly at her words, and Elena felt a rush of gratitude for his support. But she also understood that this confrontation was far from over, and that Roderick Blackwood was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. The power he wielded in Copper Creek came not just from his wealth, but from his willingness to use that wealth as a weapon against those who opposed him. "We shall see about that," Roderick said, his voice carrying a threat that made Elena's mother gasp in fear. "There are laws about honoring contracts, and I have friends who understand the importance of maintaining order in this community." Elena realized that by refusing to go through with the marriage, she had started something that could not be easily stopped. The battle lines were being drawn right here in St. Mary's Chapel, with her family's future hanging in the balance, and a stranger's unexpected kindness offering the only hope of escape from a trap that had seemed inescapable just moments before. The tension in St. Mary's Chapel had reached a breaking point, with the assembled wedding guests shifting nervously in their pews as they witnessed what might well become the most talked-about confrontation in Copper Creek's short history. Elena stood frozen between two very different futures, her elaborate wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a play she no longer wished to perform. The morning sunlight streaming through the chapel windows seemed to highlight the surreal nature of the scene, casting everything in sharp relief like a painting of some biblical drama. Sam Garrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse, peeling off notes with the casual ease of a man who understood the true value of money. He counted out an amount that made several guests gasp audibly, then added several more bills to the pile before holding it out toward Roderick. The mining heir stared at the offered money as if it were a coiled rattlesnake, his pale blue eyes calculating the implications of accepting or refusing what amounted to a public buyout of his marriage contract. $5,000, Sam announced, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel. "More than enough to cover whatever debts the Martinez family owes, plus compensation for your disappointed expectations." The figure was staggering by frontier standards, representing more cash money than most people in the territory would see in a decade of hard work. Elena felt her knees go weak at the thought that someone would offer such a sum for her freedom, while her parents exchanged glances of amazement and terror. They understood that accepting Sam's offer would free them from financial ruin, but would also make them permanent enemies of the most powerful man in 3 counties. Roderick's face had gone through several color changes during this exchange, settling finally on a mottled purple that suggested he was struggling to control his famous temper. The public nature of the confrontation had backed him into a corner where any response would cost him something valuable. If he accepted the money, he would appear to be admitting that Elena's hand could indeed be bought and sold like any other commodity. If he refused, he would seem petty and vindictive in front of witnesses who included several of his most important business partners. "This is preposterous," Roderick finally managed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You cannot simply appear at a wedding and start throwing money around like some common gambler. There are proper procedures, legal formalities that must be observed." Sam's expression remained unchanged, but Elena caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested his patience was not unlimited. "Seems to me the only legal formality that matters is whether the lady consents to marry you," he replied evenly. "And she's made her feelings on that subject pretty clear." Father Miguel stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped before him in a gesture of supplication. The elderly priest had served the spiritual needs of Copper Creek's residents for more than 20 years, and he understood better than anyone the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed life in a small frontier community. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "we might all benefit from taking some time to consider these developments in a more private setting. The house of God should not become a marketplace for disputes over temporal matters." Elena found her voice, at last, though it came out stronger than she had expected. "There is nothing to consider," she said, her dark eyes flashing with a determination that surprised even her. "I will not marry a man who sees me as property to be purchased. My family's debts are not worth the price of my soul." The words rang through the chapel with the finality of a judge's gavel, and Elena saw her mother's face crumple with grief and terror. Victoria Martinez understood that her daughter's defiance, while admirable, would have consequences that extended far beyond this moment. Roderick Blackwood was not a man who forgave public humiliation, and his influence in Copper Creek was extensive enough to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. Sam tucked the roll of bills back into his vest pocket, but Elena noticed that he kept his hands free and ready, like a man prepared for trouble. His dark eyes never left Roderick's face as he spoke. "The lady has made her choice," he said quietly. "Seems to me a gentleman would respect that decision and wish her well." Roderick's laugh was bitter and without humor. "A gentleman? You think this is about gentlemanly behavior?" He gestured around the chapel, taking in the shocked faces of the assembled guests. "This is about honoring agreements, about maintaining the order that allows civilization to flourish in places like this. If people can simply walk away from their obligations whenever they choose, what happens to the trust that makes business possible?" Elena felt a flash of anger at hearing her life reduced to a matter of business convenience. "I am not a contract to be honored," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I am a human being with the right to choose my own path, even if that path leads to hardship." Several of the wedding guests had begun edging toward the exits, sensing that the confrontation was building towards something more dangerous than harsh words. Elena noticed that most of Roderick's business associates were among those seeking escape, their loyalty apparently extending only as far as their financial interests. The few people who remained seemed genuinely concerned about the outcome, including Doc Wilson, who had moved closer to the front of the chapel as if preparing to render medical assistance. Jake Morrison, Sam's ranch foreman, had somehow materialized near the back of the church, his weathered face grim with understanding of what might be coming. Elena had heard stories about Jake's loyalty to his employer, and the way the grizzled cowboy positioned himself suggested he was prepared to back Sam's play regardless of the consequences. The sight of reinforcements seemed to give Sam additional confidence, though he appeared perfectly capable of handling the situation on his own. Roderick's pale eyes flicked between Sam and Jake, calculating odds with the cold precision of a man accustomed to wielding power through intimidation. "You think your hired guns can protect you forever, Garrett? I have resources you cannot imagine, influence that extends far beyond this provincial little town." Sam's smile was without warmth. Could be, he acknowledged. But right now in this place, what matters is that the lady doesn't want to marry you. Everything else is just noise. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who had risked so much to give her a choice. But she also understood that accepting his protection would create new complications, new debts that might prove just as binding as the ones her family already faced. Mr. Garrett, she said, turning to face him directly, I appreciate your kindness more than I can express. But I cannot allow you to sacrifice your own well-being for mine. This is my burden to bear. Sam's expression softened as he looked at her, and Elena felt something pass between them that went beyond the immediate crisis. Miss Martinez, he said gently, sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is accept help when it's offered freely. And sometimes helping someone else is exactly what a person needs to do to find their own way forward. The words carried implications that Elena did not fully understand, but she sensed layers of meaning beneath Sam's simple statement. There was something in his manner that suggested he was not acting purely from altruism, though she could not imagine what interest he might have in her welfare beyond basic human decency. Roderick had apparently reached the limits of his self-control, his carefully maintained facade of civilized behavior finally cracking under the pressure of public humiliation. Enough of this nonsense, he snarled, taking a step toward Elena. You will honor your obligations, or your family will pay the price for your selfishness. Sam moved with surprising speed for such a large man, placing himself between Roderick and Elena before the mining heir could take another step. The contrast between the two men was striking, with Sam's weathered strength making Roderick appear soft and pampered despite his expensive clothes. I think you've said enough, Sam observed mildly, though his tone carried an undertone of warning that made several guests step back involuntarily. Elena's father struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his walking stick as he prepared to face the consequences of his daughter's decision. Diego Martinez was not a large man, and the mining accident had left him permanently weakened, but there was a dignity in his bearing that commanded respect. Senor Blackwood, he said, his voice heavy with resignation, my daughter has spoken for herself. If you wish to collect the money you paid for our debts, I will find a way to repay you, even if it takes the rest of my life. The offer was noble but futile, and everyone present understood that Diego Martinez could never hope to repay such a sum through the modest income provided by the boarding house. Elena felt tears of frustration and love for her father's integrity, even as she recognized the impossibility of his promise. Sam shook his head firmly. No need for that, he said, reaching once again for his vest pocket. I meant what I said about covering the debts. A woman's freedom shouldn't come with a price tag attached to her family's future. Elena stared at him in amazement, unable to comprehend such generosity from a virtual stranger. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this for people you barely know? Sam was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made Elena's heart ache with sympathy. Because I know what it's like to lose someone to circumstances beyond your control, he said softly. And because sometimes a person gets a chance to make things right, even if it's not for the same people or in the same way. Elena sensed that there was a story behind those words, a tragedy that had shaped Sam's character in ways she was only beginning to understand. The mention of loss reminded her of what her mother had said about his deceased wife, and she wondered if his intervention on her behalf was somehow connected to his own experiences with love and sacrifice. Roderick's patience had finally reached its breaking point. This touching display of frontier nobility is all very inspiring, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But it changes nothing about the legal realities of the situation. Contracts have been signed, debts have been assumed, and I intend to see that all parties honor their obligations. Doc Wilson stepped forward from where he had been observing the confrontation, his medical bag in hand, and his expression troubled. The elderly physician had delivered Elena as a baby and watched her grow up, and his affection for the Martinez family was well known throughout Copper Creek. Roderick, he said, using the younger man's first name with the familiarity of someone who had known him since childhood. This has gone far enough. The girl has made her feelings clear, and forcing an unwilling bride to the altar serves no one's interests. Roderick turned on the doctor with a fury that made Elena flinch. Stay out of this, old man. This is a business matter that doesn't concern you. Doc Wilson's weathered face hardened with disapproval. When it comes to the welfare of people I've cared for since birth, everything concerns me, he replied firmly. I've seen enough unhappy marriages to know that forcing two unwilling people together never ends well for anyone involved. Rosa Delgado, the local midwife and seamstress who had helped Elena prepare for the wedding, spoke up from her place near the altar. The doctor is right, she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had seen the intimate details of many marriages during her years of delivering babies and caring for families. A marriage without love is like a house without a foundation. It may stand for a while, but eventually it will collapse and hurt everyone inside. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward these people who were willing to speak up on her behalf despite the potential consequences. Their support gave her the courage to stand straighter, to face Roderick with less fear than she had felt since this ordeal began. Sam reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, his movements deliberate and careful. Might be worth mentioning, he said conversationally, that I took the liberty of having a conversation with Judge Harrison before coming here today. Seems there are some interesting questions about the legality of contracts that involve trading human beings, even when those contracts are dressed up in fancy language. The revelation hit Roderick like a physical blow, his face going pale, as he absorbed the implications of Sam's words. If the marriage contract could be challenged on legal grounds, his entire strategy for acquiring Elena would crumble, leaving him with nothing but the public humiliation of having his plans thwarted by a cattle rancher. Elena's heart leaped with hope at the possibility that there might be a legal solution to her predicament. She had assumed that her family's acceptance of Roderick's money created binding obligations that could not be broken, but perhaps the situation was more complex than she had understood. Father Miguel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The church has always held that marriage must be entered into freely by both parties, he said carefully. A ceremony performed under duress or coercion would not be considered valid in the eyes of God. The priest's words carried additional weight in a community where religious authority was respected even by those who might not attend services regularly. Elena saw hope flickering in her mother's eyes for the first time since the crisis began, though Victoria Martinez still looked terrified of the consequences that might follow. Roderick seemed to realize that his carefully laid plans were unraveling beyond his ability to control. His pale blue eyes darted around the chapel, taking in the faces of people who had once deferred to his wishes without question, but who now seemed to be aligning themselves against him. The isolation was clearly unexpected and deeply unsettling for a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without resistance. This is not over, he said finally, his voice low and venomous. You may have won this particular battle, but the war is far from finished. I have a long memory, and I do not forget those who cross me. Sam's expression remained unchanged, but Elena noticed the way his hand drifted closer to the gun at his hip. Neither do I, he replied quietly, his words carrying a promise that made Roderick step back involuntarily. Elena watched as Roderick gathered the tattered remains of his dignity and stalked toward the chapel exit, his expensive boots echoing harshly against the wooden floor. Several of his business associates followed at a discreet distance, their faces carefully neutral as they calculated the implications of the morning's events for their own financial interests. As the chapel door slammed shut behind Roderick's departing figure, Elena felt as if she could breathe freely for the first time in months. The elaborate wedding dress that had felt like a burial shroud now seemed lighter, transformed from a symbol of captivity into evidence of her escape from a trap that had seemed inescapable. But even as relief flooded through her, Elena understood that her troubles were far from over. Roderick Blackwood was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and his threat of future retribution was not idle. She had won her freedom, but the price of that victory remained to be calculated. Sam approached her slowly, his massive frame somehow managing to seem unthreatening despite his obvious strength. "Are you all right, Miss Martinez?" he asked gently, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of distress. Elena nodded, though she felt anything but all right. The events of the morning had left her emotionally drained and uncertain about what came next. "I think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." Sam's smile transformed his weathered features, revealing a warmth that made Elena's heart skip unexpectedly. "No repayment necessary," he said firmly. "But we should probably get you and your family somewhere safe while we figure out what happens next." Roderick Blackwood strikes me as the type who might decide to take his disappointment out on anyone within reach. The weeks following Elena's dramatic escape from marriage had transformed the quiet rhythms of life at the Garrett Ranch in ways that neither Sam nor Elena could have anticipated. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful, as Elena found herself not merely a guest seeking temporary shelter, but an integral part of the daily operations that kept the sprawling cattle operation running smoothly through the harsh Colorado autumn. Elena had initially protested when Sam insisted that she and her parents move to the ranch for their own protection, arguing that they had already imposed enough on his generosity. But Sam's gentle insistence, combined with the very real threat that Roderick Blackwood represented, had eventually overcome her reluctance. The ranch house, built by Sam's father and expanded over the years, had more than enough room for additional residents, and Elena's mother Victoria had quickly made herself indispensable by taking over the cooking and household management duties that Sam had been handling alone since his wife's death. The transition had not been without its challenges. Elena's father Diego struggled with accepting what felt like charity, his pride wounded by the circumstances that had forced his family to depend on the kindness of strangers. But Sam's matter-of-fact approach to their presence, treating them as valued household members rather than refugees, had gradually eased the older man's discomfort. Diego's experience keeping books for the boarding house proved invaluable in managing the ranch's complex financial records, giving him a sense of purpose that helped restore some of his wounded dignity. Elena herself had found unexpected fulfillment in the demanding but rewarding work of ranch life. Her teaching skills proved surprisingly adaptable to training the younger ranch hands in reading and basic mathematics, while her quick mind and attention to detail made her an excellent assistant in managing the cattle breeding records that were crucial to the operation's success. More importantly, she had discovered a strength within herself that she had never known existed, a resilience that had been forged in the crucible of her near marriage to Roderick and tempered by the demanding physical and emotional challenges of frontier life. The relationship between Elena and Sam had evolved gradually, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than the passionate declarations of romantic novels. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their partnership developing the easy rhythm of two people who understood each other's strengths and compensated naturally for each other's weaknesses. Elena found herself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, when Sam would share his plans for the day's work and seek her input on decisions that affected the ranch's operations. Sam, for his part, had begun to emerge from the shell of grief and isolation that had enclosed him since Martha's death. Elena's presence in the house had brought back sounds and rhythms that he had thought lost forever: the rustle of skirts on wooden floors, the soft humming of someone content with their work, the warmth of genuine companionship that made even the longest winter evenings pass pleasantly. He found himself remembering how to laugh again, rediscovering joy in simple pleasures that grief had rendered meaningless for too long. The threat of Roderick's vengeance had materialized in various petty forms over the weeks since the failed wedding. Several of Sam's business relationships in town had cooled noticeably, as merchants and suppliers who depended on Blackwood's goodwill found excuses to avoid dealing with the ranch. Anonymous letters had appeared, warning Sam that his interference in matters that didn't concern him would have consequences, though no direct action had been taken. Elena lived with a constant undercurrent of anxiety, knowing that her freedom had come at a cost that others were paying on her behalf. But Roderick's most serious miscalculation had been underestimating the depth of loyalty that Sam commanded among the working people of Copper Creek Valley. The smaller ranchers, the independent miners, the shopkeepers who served the common folk rather than the wealthy elite, had rallied around Sam's cause with a solidarity that surprised even him. They understood that the confrontation in St. Mary's Chapel had been about more than one woman's right to choose her husband. It had been a stand against the kind of economic tyranny that threatened the independence of every working family in the territory. Doc Wilson had been particularly vocal in his support, using his respected position in the community to counter Roderick's influence wherever possible. The elderly physician had made it clear that he would not tolerate any attempt to use economic pressure against families who chose to associate with the Garrett Ranch, and his moral authority carried enough weight to make even Roderick's allies think twice about their actions. Rosa Delgado had also emerged as an unexpected champion of Elena's cause, organizing the other women in town to ensure that the Martinez family felt welcomed and supported in their new circumstances. The midwife's extensive network of relationships, built through decades of attending births and caring for families, proved more influential than Roderick had anticipated, creating a web of loyalty that protected Elena from the social ostracism that might otherwise have accompanied her dramatic rejection of the marriage. As autumn deepened into winter, Elena found herself settling into routines that felt increasingly natural and satisfying. She had taken over the management of the ranch's extensive vegetable gardens, applying knowledge learned from her mother and grandmother to ensure that the household would have fresh produce through the cold months ahead. Her careful attention to preservation and storage had resulted in cellars full of canned goods and dried vegetables that would sustain them when fresh food became scarce. The work was physically demanding but emotionally fulfilling in ways that Elena had never experienced before. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing the direct results of her labor in the form of well-fed ranch hands and an efficiently run household. She had discovered muscles she never knew she possessed and developed a tan that would have horrified her former friends in town, but she had never felt stronger or more confident in her abilities. Sam watched her transformation with growing admiration and something deeper that he was not yet ready to name. The frightened young woman in the elaborate wedding dress had evolved into someone whose strength and competence commanded respect from everyone on the ranch. She handled the most difficult horses with patience and skill, mediated disputes between the ranch hands with wisdom beyond her years, and brought an organizational efficiency to the household management that had been sorely lacking since Martha's death. The evening came when everything changed, though it began ordinarily enough. Elena was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Victoria tended to Diego, whose leg had been bothering him more than usual as the weather turned cold. Sam had just returned from checking on the cattle in the far pastures, and the warmth of the house after hours in the bitter wind felt like a blessing. He found Elena stirring a pot of stew that filled the kitchen with the rich aroma of beef and vegetables, her dark hair escaping its pins to curl around her face in the steam. "Smells like heaven," Sam said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door and moving to warm his hands by the stove. Elena smiled without looking up from her work. "Mama's recipe, but I added some of those wild herbs Rosa taught me to identify. They should help with Papa's inflammation." The casual way she referred to caring for Diego as if he were her own responsibility rather than an obligation touched something deep in Sam's chest. Over the weeks, he had watched Elena take on the role of daughter and caregiver with a devotion that spoke to the strength of her character. She never complained about the additional work or the worry that Diego's condition caused, simply accepted it as part of her duty to those she loved. "Your papa's lucky to have you," Sam said quietly, meaning more than just the immediate care she provided. Elena finally looked up, meeting his eyes with an expression that held depths he was still learning to navigate. "We're all lucky," she said softly. "I never imagined that losing everything could lead to finding so much more." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had yet spoken aloud. Sam felt his heart rate increase as he recognized the invitation in Elena's voice, the suggestion that their relationship had moved beyond simple gratitude and mutual respect into something that might change both their lives forever. "Elena," he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice feelings that had been growing stronger each day, but which still felt too precious and fragile to expose to the harsh light of words. She set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious but unafraid. "Sam, I need to tell you something that I should have said weeks ago. What you did for me, for my family, was more than an act of kindness. You gave me back my life, my choices, my dignity. But more than that, you showed me what it means to be truly cared for, not as property or obligation, but as a person whose happiness matters. Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion as he struggled to find words worthy of the moment. You don't owe me anything, Elena. What I did because it was right, not because I expected gratitude or payment. Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. I know that, she said gently. That's exactly why I love you. The simple declaration hit Sam like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his heart stutter in his chest. He had hoped, had begun to believe that Elena's feelings might mirror his own, but hearing the words spoken aloud was more overwhelming than he had anticipated. You don't have to say anything, Elena continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. I just needed you to know. These weeks living here, working beside you, watching the way you treat everyone with such kindness and respect, seeing the man you really are beneath that intimidating exterior. I couldn't keep pretending that my feelings were just gratitude. Sam reached out with trembling hands to cup her face, his calloused thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had begun to fall. Elena, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I love you too. More than I thought I could ever love anyone again. You've brought light back into this house, joy back into my life, hope for a future I thought I'd lost forever. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if both were afraid that too much passion might shatter the delicate moment. But as Elena's arms came up to circle Sam's neck and she pressed closer to his massive frame, the kiss deepened, years of loneliness and months of growing attraction finally finding expression in the connection they had both been afraid to hope for. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Sam rested his forehead against Elena's, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just passed between them. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. After Martha died, I believed that part of my life was over forever. Elena's hands framed his face, her touch gentle but sure. It's not betraying her. Memory to find love again, she said softly. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it grows stronger. Martha would want you to be happy. The wisdom in her words, the generous spirit that could embrace his past love without jealousy or resentment, only deepened Sam's certainty that Elena was the partner he wanted for whatever time remained to him on earth. Marry me, he said, suddenly, the words escaping before he could consider their timing or appropriateness. I know it's too soon. I know you've just escaped one unwanted marriage. But Elena, I can't imagine my life without you in it. Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her face in a way that made Sam's heart race. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Garrett. Not because I have to, not because of obligation or debt or fear, but because I choose to. Because I love you and want to build a life with you. The sound of approaching footsteps reminded them that they were not alone in the house, and they stepped apart just as Victoria Martinez entered the kitchen, her knowing smile suggesting that she had heard enough to understand what had transpired. It's about time, she said warmly, embracing first her daughter and then Sam with maternal affection. I was beginning to wonder if you two would ever stop dancing around each other and admit what everyone else could see. Diego's voice called from the sitting room, asking about dinner, and the domestic routine reasserted itself with gentle insistence. But as Elena returned to her cooking and Sam helped set the table, both moved with a new awareness of each other, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond the immediate tasks at hand. They were no longer two people thrown together by circumstances. They were partners planning a future built on love and mutual choice. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp December morning when fresh snow had transformed the valley into a wonderland of pristine white. This time, Elena wore her grandmother's simple but elegant dress, altered by Rosa Delgado to fit her perfectly, and the ceremony was held in the same chapel where her first wedding attempt had ended in chaos. But everything else was different, from the genuine joy on the faces of the guests to the radiant happiness that seemed to emanate from both bride and groom. Father Miguel performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, his weathered face beaming, as he pronounced Sam and Elena husband and wife. The kiss they shared was passionate but reverent, a public declaration of love that had been tested by adversity and proven strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Doc Wilson stood as Sam's best man, his presence a symbol of the community support that had sustained them through the difficult weeks following Elena's escape from Roderick. Rosa Delgado served as Elena's matron of honor, her skilled hands having created the simple but beautiful decorations that transformed the chapel into a setting worthy of the love being celebrated. Roderick Blackwood was notably absent, having left Copper Creek shortly after his public humiliation. Word had reached the valley that he had moved to Denver, where his mining interests required less personal involvement and his reputation was not quite so damaged. His departure had removed the immediate threat to Elena's safety and allowed the community to begin healing from the divisions his presence had created. The reception was held at the ranch, with the great room filled with neighbors and friends who had come to celebrate the union of two people whose love story had become legend in the valley. Jake Morrison provided music on his fiddle, while the wives of various ranchers had contributed enough food to feed an army. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere that marked this as a true community celebration. As the evening deepened and the guests began to depart, Elena found herself alone with Sam on the porch of the house that was now truly their home. The stars above were brilliant in the clear mountain air and the sounds of the departing guests gradually faded into the peaceful silence of the winter night. "No regrets?" Sam asked softly, pulling Elena closer against his side to ward off the cold. Elena looked up at her husband, this gentle giant who had rescued her from a fate worse than death and shown her what true love could be. "Only that. It took a crisis to bring us together," she replied, her voice warm with contentment. "But perhaps that's how the best things happen, when we least expect them and most need them." Sam's arms tightened around her as he considered the truth of her words. His intervention at the chapel had been impulsive, driven by a sense of justice rather than any expectation of personal gain. But in saving Elena, he had somehow saved himself, finding in her love the healing that years of solitude had failed to provide. 6 months later, Elena's condition became apparent to the experienced eyes of Rosa Delgado, who announced her suspicions with the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in the valley. The news filled Sam with a joy so profound that he could barely contain it, while Elena glowed with the satisfaction of a woman whose deepest dreams were finally coming true. The child was born the following spring, a daughter with Elena's dark eyes and Sam's strong chin, whose lusty cries proclaimed her arrival to anyone within a mile of the ranch house. They named her Maria Elena Garrett, honoring both her heritage and her mother's courage, and Sam's declaration that she would bear. His son starting tonight became a gentle family joke as he devoted himself utterly to his daughter's welfare. Diego's health improved dramatically as he found new purpose in caring for his granddaughter, while Victoria took on the role of devoted grandmother with enthusiasm that transformed her from a woman aged by worry into someone who seemed to grow younger with each passing day. The boarding house in town was sold to pay off the last of the family's debts, but none of them missed the cramped quarters and uncertain income it had provided. Elena continued to manage much of the ranch's daily operations, her organizational skills and attention to detail helping to increase profitability year after year. Sam delighted in consulting her on major decisions, finding that her perspective often revealed solutions he might have missed. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and shared responsibility, a model of marriage that inspired other couples in the valley to reconsider their own relationships. As the years passed, Maria was joined by 3 brothers, each birth, strengthening the bonds that held the growing family together. Sam's prediction about sons had proven accurate, though Elena teased him that his timing had been somewhat optimistic. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with new wings added as needed and the sound of children's laughter filling rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. Elena never forgot the terror of that morning in St. Mary's Chapel, when her future had seemed as bleak as a winter storm. But she remembered it without bitterness, understanding that even the darkest moments could be transformed into stepping stones toward happiness. Her marriage to Sam had taught her that love was not about possession or control, but about partnership and mutual growth, about 2 people choosing each day to build something beautiful together. The story of the giant cowboy who had rescued the frightened bride became part of the valley's folklore, told and retold around winter fires as an example of what could happen when courage met compassion. But for Elena and Sam, it was simply the beginning of a love story that grew stronger with each passing season, proving that sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the willingness to step forward in faith when the moment demanded everything they had to give. 10 years had passed since the dramatic confrontation in St. Mary's Chapel, and the Garrett Ranch had become the beating heart of Copper Creek Valley, a symbol of prosperity built on love, hard work, and unwavering principles. The sprawling property now encompassed thousands of acres of prime grazing land, its success a testament to the partnership between Sam and Elena that had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire character of the surrounding community. Elena stood on the wide front porch of the ranch house, watching her 4 children play in the yard while the morning sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Maria, now 9 years old, had inherited her mother's quick mind and her father's gentle strength, serving as a natural leader among her younger brothers as they chased chickens and built elaborate forts from hay bales. Samuel Jr., 7, possessed his father's massive frame in miniature and showed every sign of growing into an equally imposing figure, though his nature was as gentle as a summer breeze. Diego, 5, had been named for his grandfather and shared the older man's careful attention to detail and love of books, often found reading in quiet corners when he should have been playing with his siblings. Little Carlos, barely 3, was the family clown, his infectious laughter capable of brightening even the darkest days. The children spoke both English and Spanish with equal fluency, Elena having insisted that they maintain connection to her heritage while embracing their father's world. Sam had supported this completely, understanding that strength came from acknowledging all parts of one's identity rather than hiding from any portion of the past. He had even learned considerable Spanish himself, delighting Elena with his earnest attempts to master the language that connected her to her parents and grandparents. Elena's pregnancy with their 5th child was beginning to show, a gentle rounding of her figure that filled Sam with the same wonder he had experienced with each previous addition to their family. At 32, Elena had grown into a woman of quiet authority whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of the ranch. Her reputation for wisdom and fair dealing had made her a sought-after mediator in disputes throughout the valley, while her organizational skills had helped establish the first real school in Copper Creek, where she served as the primary teacher for children from all the surrounding ranches and farms. Sam's own transformation over the decade had been equally remarkable. The lonely, grief-stricken man who had intervened at Elena's wedding had evolved into someone whose presence commanded respect throughout the territory. His cattle operation had become the largest and most successful in 3 counties. But more importantly, his treatment of workers and business partners had set a new standard for ethical conduct that other ranchers were beginning to emulate. He paid fair wages, provided decent housing for his workers, and never used his economic power to exploit those who depended on him for their livelihoods. The ranch house itself had grown along with the family, new rooms and wings added as needed until it had become one of the most impressive homes in the region. But despite its size and comfort, it remained a place where visitors from any walk of life were welcomed with genuine warmth. Elena's parents, Diego and Victoria, had aged gracefully in the security and comfort of their daughter's home, becoming beloved figures not just to their grandchildren, but to the entire community that had come to regard them as treasures to be cherished and protected. Diego Martinez had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself, by discovering a talent for teaching mathematics and bookkeeping to the children who attended Elena's school. His mining accident injury had never fully healed, but his sharp mind had found new purpose in education, and he took enormous pride in watching young people master skills that would serve them well in an increasingly complex world. His relationship with Sam had evolved from grudging acceptance to genuine affection and respect, the 2 men bonding over their shared commitment to family and community welfare. Victoria had become the unofficial grandmother to every child in the valley, her kitchen serving as a gathering place where recipes were shared, problems were discussed, and solutions were found through the simple expedient of caring neighbors. Working together, Her boarding house skills had transferred seamlessly to managing the complex logistics of running a large ranch household, and her gentle wisdom had helped resolve countless disputes and misunderstandings over the years. The success of the Garrett Ranch had not gone unnoticed by those who measured such things in dollars and influence. Representatives from Eastern investment firms had made increasingly generous offers to purchase the operation, drawn by its profitability and strategic location. Sam had rejected each approach without serious consideration, understanding that some things were more valuable than money and that his family's happiness was not for sale at any price. Elena shared his sentiments completely, having learned through bitter experience the difference between a life built on genuine love and one constructed around financial arrangements. The ranch represented far more than a business venture. It was the physical manifestation of their shared dreams and values, a legacy they were building not just for their own children, but for the entire community that had supported them through their greatest challenges. The anniversary of Elena's escape from her forced marriage had become an unofficial celebration throughout Copper Creek Valley, though none of the participants ever referred to it in such direct terms. Instead, the community had established a harvest festival that happened to fall on the same date, bringing together families from throughout the region for a day of food, music, and storytelling that strengthened the bonds connecting them all. Elena always made sure to attend these gatherings, understanding that her presence served as a living reminder that courage and determination could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. Roderick Blackwood's name was rarely mentioned anymore, though reports occasionally filtered back from Denver about his continued business activities. Those who had known him in Copper Creek were not surprised to learn that he had never married, his reputation for cruelty having preceded him to the larger city and made it difficult for him to find a woman willing to accept his proposals. Elena felt only pity for him now, understanding that his inability to form genuine human connections had condemned him to a loneliness far more profound than anything she had ever experienced. The changes in Copper Creek itself had been equally dramatic over the decade. What had once been a rough frontier town dependent on mining and the whims of wealthy outsiders had evolved into a thriving community with its own identity and sense of purpose. The school that Elena had helped establish had produced a generation of young people equipped with the education necessary to pursue opportunities throughout the territory, though many chose to remain in the valley and contribute to its continued growth and development. Doc Wilson, now in his 70s but still practicing medicine with the same dedication he had shown for decades, often remarked that Elena's wedding day had marked a turning point for the entire community. The public stand against economic intimidation had inspired others to assert their own independence, creating a culture of mutual support that protected everyone from the kind of exploitation that had once seemed inevitable in isolated frontier settlements. Rosa Delgado had become Elena's closest friend and most trusted advisor, the midwife's experience and wisdom proving invaluable as Elena navigated the challenges of raising 4 children while helping to manage a complex business operation. Rosa had delivered all of Elena's children and would soon attend the birth of the 5th, her presence providing continuity and comfort during some of life's most intense moments. Father Miguel, though showing his age, continued to serve the spiritual needs of the valley's residents, his sermons often touching on themes of courage, compassion, and the importance of standing up for those who could not protect themselves. The elderly priest took particular pride in the transformation he had witnessed since that dramatic morning when Sam had interrupted what should have been Elena's wedding to another man. He often said that witnessing their love story had renewed his own faith in the power of divine providence to bring good from even the most desperate circumstances. Jake Morrison remained Sam's most trusted foreman, his loyalty and competence having been instrumental in the ranch's success. Jake had married Rosa's daughter Carmen 5 years earlier, and their own growing family added to the sense of extended kinship that characterized life on the Garrett Ranch. The interconnections between families created a network of relationships that provided security and support for everyone involved, demonstrating the power of community to overcome individual hardships. Elena often reflected on the contrast between her current life and the future that had awaited her as Roderick's wife. Instead of living in fear and isolation, she woke each morning surrounded by love and purpose. Instead of being treated as property, she was valued as a partner whose opinions and contributions were essential to every major decision. Instead of bearing children to a man who would view them as possessions, she was raising young people who understood that their worth came from their character and actions rather than their family's wealth or social position. The lessons Elena had learned during her escape from forced marriage had shaped her approach to raising her own children. Maria and her brothers were taught from an early age that respect must be earned rather than demanded, that true strength came from protecting those who were vulnerable rather than exploiting them, and that love was a choice that had to be made repeatedly rather than an emotion that could be taken for granted. These principles guided every aspect of their education, from their academic studies to their training in ranch work to their interactions with neighbors and visitors. Sam's own parenting style reflected the same values, though his approach was shaped by his memories of growing up without the security that his children enjoyed. He made sure to spend individual time with each child, understanding that his imposing physical presence could be intimidating unless balanced by genuine warmth and attention. His children adored him without fearing him, a delicate balance that required constant mindfulness, but which produced young people who were confident in their worth while remaining respectful of others. The success of their marriage had become a model for other couples throughout the valley, demonstrating that true partnership required mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than traditional divisions of authority. Elena's active role in business decisions had initially scandalized some of the more conservative community members, but the ranch's prosperity had gradually converted even the most skeptical observers to the wisdom of utilizing all available talents regardless of gender. Elena's influence extended beyond her immediate family to encompass the broader community through her teaching and her informal role as an advisor on matters ranging from business disputes to family problems. People sought her counsel because they trusted her judgment and knew that her advice would be based on genuine concern for their welfare rather than any ulterior motive. This reputation had been earned through years of consistent behavior that demonstrated her commitment to the common good above personal advantage. The arrival of the railroad in Copper Creek the previous year had brought new opportunities and challenges to the valley. The improved transportation links made it easier to ship cattle to distant markets and to receive manufactured goods from the east, but they also brought increased outside interest in the region's resources and potential for development. Elena and Sam had worked together with other community leaders to ensure that the changes benefited local residents rather than merely enriching distant investors. Elena's fifth pregnancy had proceeded smoothly, her experience with previous births having taught her to recognize the signs and rhythms of her body's preparation for new life. Rosa had assured her that everything appeared normal, though the midwife had expressed some concern about Elena's tendency to remain active right up until labor began. At 32, Elena was no longer the young woman who had borne her first child, and Rosa worried that she might be taking unnecessary risks by maintaining her usual demanding schedule. Sam shared Rosa's concerns and had been gently trying to convince Elena to reduce her activities as her due date approached. His protective instincts had grown stronger with each pregnancy, though he was careful not to express his worries in ways that might make Elena feel constrained or diminished. Their relationship had always been built on mutual respect for each other's judgment, and he trusted her understanding of her own capabilities even while hoping she would choose caution over ambition. The question of names for the coming child had sparked lengthy family discussions, with each of the existing children having strong opinions about what their new sibling should be called. Maria favored traditional names that honored family heritage, while the boys leaned toward more adventurous choices that reflected their own spirited natures. Elena and Sam listened to all suggestions with equal seriousness, understanding that involving the children in such decisions helped them feel ownership and responsibility for their new brother or sister. Elena had experienced particularly vivid dreams during this pregnancy, many of them featuring scenes from the day of her escape from marriage to Roderick. In these dreams, she often found herself back in St. Mary's Chapel, wearing the elaborate wedding dress that had felt like a shroud. But instead of fear and desperation, she felt only gratitude for the chain of events that had led to her current happiness. The dreams seemed to be her mind's way of processing the magnitude of the transformation her life had undergone and of acknowledging the courage that had been required to step into an uncertain future. Sam had noticed Elena's increased dreaminess and occasional distant looks, understanding from experience that pregnancy often brought with it a heightened awareness of life's deeper meanings and connections. He had learned to provide gentle support during these reflective periods, offering physical comfort and emotional presence without demanding explanations for moods and thoughts that might be difficult to articulate. The ranch's success had enabled Elena and Sam to contribute significantly to various charitable causes throughout the territory, their donations helping to establish schools, support churches, and provide assistance to families facing hardship. Elena insisted that their giving be done quietly and without expectation of recognition, understanding that true generosity was motivated by concern for others rather than desire for public acclaim. This approach had earned them respect even from people who had never benefited directly from their charity. Elena's influence on Sam's business practices had been subtle but profound, encouraging him to consider the long-term implications of decisions rather than focusing solely on immediate profits. Her perspective had led to innovations in worker housing, improvements in safety procedures, and the establishment of a profit-sharing system that gave employees a stake in the ranch's success. These policies had initially cost money, but had ultimately proven more profitable than traditional approaches because they attracted the best workers and inspired loyalty that could not be purchased. The approaching birth had prompted Elena to reflect on the cyclical nature of life and the ways in which each generation built upon the foundations laid by those who came before. Her children would inherit not just the physical assets of the ranch, but also the values and relationships that had made its success possible. She felt a deep responsibility to ensure that they understood the difference between wealth that came from exploitation and prosperity that was built on service to others. Sam had commissioned a portrait of the family to be painted by a traveling artist, wanting to capture this moment in their lives before the new baby arrived and changed the family dynamics once again. The painting showed Elena surrounded by her children, with Sam's strong presence anchoring the group, and it would hang in the main hall as a reminder of the love that had transformed a house into a home and a business arrangement into a true partnership. The labor began on a crisp October morning, just as the valley's aspen trees were reaching their peak golden glory. Elena had been helping Maria with her arithmetic lessons when the first contraction started, and she finished explaining a particularly difficult problem before calmly announcing that it was time to send for Rosa. The children, experienced now in the rhythms of new arrivals, helped gather supplies and prepare the birthing room with the efficiency of a well-trained medical team. Sam's nervousness during Elena's labor had not diminished with experience, and he found himself pacing the front porch like an expectant father facing his first child rather than his fifth. Diego and Victoria took turns keeping him company and ensuring that he ate something despite his lack of appetite, understanding that his worry was a reflection of his deep love rather than any lack of confidence in Elena's strength. The birth proceeded smoothly under Rosa's experienced guidance, and Elena's fifth child proved to be another daughter, whose lusty cries announced her arrival to the entire household. Sam's joy at holding his newest daughter was tempered only by his overwhelming relief that Elena had come through the birth safely, and he spent long minutes simply looking back and forth between his wife and child, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. They named the baby Victoria Elena, honoring both Elena's mother and her own courage, and the newest Garrett took her place in a family where love was abundant and security was taken for granted. Maria immediately appointed herself as assistant caregiver, while the boys adjusted to having another sister with the adaptability that characterized their entire generation. Elena's recovery was swift and complete, her strong constitution and positive attitude serving her well during the vulnerable weeks following birth. She was soon back to her usual activities, though Rosa and Sam conspired to ensure that she did not overexert herself during the adjustment period. The ranch routine accommodated the new addition seamlessly, demonstrating the resilience and flexibility that had become hallmarks of the Garrett family's approach to life's challenges and opportunities. The christening of Victoria Elena became another community celebration, with neighbors from throughout the valley gathering to welcome the newest member of a family that had become central to the region's identity and prosperity. Father Miguel performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, his blessing encompassing not just the baby, but the entire family, whose love story continued to inspire everyone who knew them. As Elena stood in the same chapel where her first wedding had been interrupted 10 years earlier, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived according to her own values and choices. The frightened young woman in the elaborate wedding dress had evolved into someone whose strength and wisdom had touched countless lives, proving that the most powerful transformations often began with simple acts of courage in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Sam's declaration that she would bear his sons had become a family legend, referenced with gentle humor whenever anyone wanted to tease him about his romantic pronouncements. But the deeper truth behind his words, the recognition that their love would create new life and new possibilities, had proven prophetic in ways that extended far beyond the children they had brought into the world together. The evening of the christening found Elena and Sam once again alone on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky while their children slept safely inside. The sounds of departing guests had faded into the peaceful silence of the valley night, leaving them to contemplate the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. Elena reflected on the amazing truth that what had begun as the worst day of her life had ultimately led to the greatest happiness she could have imagined. The forced marriage that had filled her with terror had been the catalyst for meeting the man who would become her true partner in every sense of the word. The crisis that had seemed to threaten her family's survival had instead provided the foundation for security and prosperity beyond anything they had previously known. Sam's arms around her felt as strong and comforting as they had on that first night when he had offered her protection from Roderick's cruelty. But now they carried the additional weight of shared history and proven devotion. He had kept every promise he had made, spoken and unspoken, creating a life where Elena could flourish as both individual and partner, mother and community leader, dreamer and practical problem solver. Their love story had become part of the valley's folklore, told and retold as an example of what could happen when courage met compassion and when two people chose to build something beautiful together rather than accepting the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. But for Elena and Sam, it was simply the ongoing reality of a life lived in partnership, with each day bringing new opportunities to choose love over fear, service over selfishness, and hope over despair. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities as bright as the stars above, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges or joys awaited, they would face them together with the same love and determination that had carried them through their greatest trials and their most precious victories. The golden afternoon sun of late summer cast long shadows across the sprawling grounds of the Garrett Ranch as Elena sat in her favorite rocking chair on the wraparound porch, her newest grandson sleeping peacefully in her arms. At 57, Elena's dark hair now showed silver threads that caught the light like spun moonbeams, and her face bore the lines that came from decades of laughter, hard work, and genuine contentment. The baby in her arms belonged to Maria, now 28 and married to the local schoolmaster, and this precious bundle represented the third generation to call the ranch home. 25 years had transformed the Copper Creek Valley beyond recognition, though the fundamental values that Elena and Sam had instilled throughout the community remained as strong as the mountain peaks that surrounded them. The railroad that had arrived years earlier had brought prosperity and growth, but careful planning and community solidarity had ensured that development enhanced rather than destroyed the character that made the valley a place where families wanted to put down roots and build lasting legacies. Elena watched with quiet satisfaction as her children and grandchildren moved about the ranch grounds, each absorbed in their own activities, but all contributing to the harmonious rhythm that had characterized life at the Garrett place for more than 2 decades. Samuel Jr., now 24, had grown into his father's massive frame and gentle temperament, managing the day-to-day operations of the cattle business with the same combination of strength and wisdom that had made his father legendary throughout the territory. His wife, a spirited young woman from Denver who had fallen in love with both the man and the ranch lifestyle, was expecting their second child, and seemed perfectly suited to the demands of frontier life. Diego, 22, had inherited his grandfather's love of numbers and learning, establishing himself as the most sought-after accountant and financial advisor in 3 counties. His expertise had helped numerous ranching and mining families navigate the increasingly complex world of territorial business, and his reputation for honesty and discretion had made him wealthy in his own right. Unlike some young men who might have used their success to distance themselves from their humble origins, Diego remained deeply connected to the ranch and the community that had shaped his character. Carlos, now 20, possessed the artistic temperament that sometimes appeared unexpectedly in families rooted in practical concerns. His paintings of ranch life and mountain landscapes had begun attracting attention from collectors as far away as San Francisco, but he showed no desire to leave the valley that provided him with endless inspiration. His studio, built in a converted barn, had become a gathering place for the handful of other artists and writers who had discovered the beauty and tranquility of Copper Creek. Little Victoria Elena, now 15 and no longer little, had inherited her mother's quick mind and natural leadership abilities along with her father's imposing physical presence. Already tall for her age and showing every sign of reaching Elena's own height, she moved through the world with a confidence that commanded respect from peers and adults alike. Her academic achievements had earned her acceptance to several prestigious Eastern schools, though she seemed inclined to remain in the valley and attend the regional university that had been established in the growing town of Copper Creek. The youngest members of the family, the grandchildren ranging in age from newborn to 8 years old, brought an energy and joy to the ranch that reminded Elena daily of the cycle of renewal that kept families and communities vital across generations. Their laughter echoed from every corner of the property, and their innocent questions often provided insights that escaped more sophisticated adult minds. Sam, now 63, had aged gracefully into the role of patriarch and elder statesman, his massive frame still imposing, but his demeanor softened by years of happiness and the wisdom that came from watching children and grandchildren grow into capable, caring adults. His hair had gone completely white, giving him a distinguished appearance that commanded instant respect in business dealings and community gatherings. The local territorial government had repeatedly tried to convince him to run for various offices, but he consistently declined, preferring to exercise his influence through example and private consultation rather than public position. The ranch itself had expanded far beyond Sam's wildest dreams from those early days when he had been a lonely widower struggling to find meaning in work and solitude. The original property now encompassed over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, supporting herds that numbered in the thousands and providing employment for more than 200 families throughout the valley. But size had not come at the expense of the personal touch that made the Garrett operation special. Every employee knew that they were valued as individuals rather than merely units of labor. Elena's influence on the community had grown steadily over the decades, though she wielded her power so gently that many people were unaware of the extent to which their own opportunities and security depended on her behind-the-scenes efforts. Her network of relationships, built through years of teaching, mediating disputes, and simply being available when people needed help, had created an informal system of mutual support that protected the valley's residents from the kind of economic exploitation that plagued other frontier regions. The school that Elena had helped establish had evolved into a full educational system that attracted families from hundreds of miles away, drawn by the reputation for academic excellence combined with practical life skills that prepared young people for success in any field they chose to pursue. Elena continued to teach advanced classes, though she had gradually shifted her focus from basic education to mentoring the brightest students and helping them navigate the transition from rural childhood to adult responsibilities in an increasingly complex world. Doc Wilson had passed away 5 years earlier, mourned by the entire community as the end of an era, but his legacy lived on through the medical clinic that had been established in his honor and the young doctors who had been inspired by his example to dedicate their lives to frontier medicine. Elena had spoken at his funeral, her words capturing the essence of a man who had measured his success not in personal wealth, but in the number of lives he had been able to save and improve through skilled care and genuine compassion. Rosa Delgado, now in her 70s, remained active as the valley's premier midwife and unofficial keeper of family histories, her memory serving as a living archive of births, deaths, marriages, and the countless small events that gave meaning to individual lives. She had delivered all of Elena's children and most of her grandchildren, providing continuity across generations and serving as a bridge between the valley's past and its future. Her presence at family gatherings brought a sense of connection to the larger story of which each individual life was a precious part. Father Miguel had been succeeded by a younger priest, but the elderly clergyman's influence remained strong in the community's commitment to treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances or background. The church he had served for so many years had been rebuilt and expanded twice to accommodate the growing population, but it retained the simple, welcoming character that reflected the values he had preached and lived throughout his long ministry. Elena often thought about the path that had brought her to this moment of deep satisfaction and purpose. The terrified young woman who had stood at the altar in that same church, facing a future that promised nothing but misery and degradation, could never have imagined the richness and fulfillment that awaited her just beyond the horizon of her worst fears. Every challenge had become a stepping stone to greater strength. Every setback had revealed new opportunities for growth and service. The marriage that had begun with Sam's dramatic intervention had evolved into a partnership so complete and natural that Elena sometimes forgot where her own thoughts ended and his began. They had learned to anticipate each other's needs and responses, to communicate in the shorthand of shared experience and deep understanding that made words often unnecessary. Their love had deepened rather than faded with time, tempered by trials, and enriched by the countless small kindnesses and considerations that built trust between two people committed to each other's happiness. The financial security that had seemed so important during those desperate months before her escape from Roderick had proven to be only the foundation for more meaningful forms of wealth. The ranch's prosperity had enabled Elena and Sam to contribute to causes they believed in, to provide opportunities for young people who might not otherwise have access to education and advancement, and to create employment that supported entire families in dignity and comfort. Elena's relationship with her parents had been one of the unexpected joys of her later years. Diego and Victoria had lived to see their great-grandchildren, their own lives enriched immeasurably by the security and love that surrounded them during their final decades. Diego had continued teaching until shortly before his death at 82, his sharp mind and gentle manner inspiring several generations of students to pursue learning as a lifelong adventure. Victoria had presided over family gatherings with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had lived to see her sacrifices vindicated and her deepest hopes fulfilled. The threat that Roderick Blackwood had once represented had faded into historical irrelevance, though Elena occasionally heard news of his activities in Denver and other urban centers throughout the territory. He had never married, his reputation for cruelty having preceded him wherever he went and making it impossible for him to find a woman willing to accept his proposals regardless of the financial inducements he offered. The loneliness that Elena had escaped through courage and Sam's intervention had become Roderick's permanent condition, a consequence of his inability to see other people as anything more than objects to be possessed and controlled. Elena's own reputation had spread far beyond Copper Creek Valley, drawing visitors who came seeking her advice on everything from family disputes to business strategies to educational philosophy. She received these guests with the same warm hospitality that characterized all aspects of ranch life, understanding that her experiences might provide guidance for others facing their own crossroads and difficult choices. The territorial government had recently been reorganized in preparation for eventual statehood, and Elena had been invited to participate in several committees focused on education and women's rights. While she remained committed primarily to her family and local community, she understood that broader influence carried responsibilities that she could not ignore. Her voice in territorial affairs helped ensure that rural concerns received appropriate attention and that policies reflected the values of families who had built their lives through honest work and mutual support. Sam's business reputation had evolved beyond cattle ranching to encompass banking, railroad development, and territorial politics, though he continued to approach each new venture with the same principles that had guided his original success. His word was considered as reliable as any written contract throughout the region, and his reputation for fair dealing had made him wealthy beyond anything either he or Elena had ever imagined possible during their early years together. The grandchildren, who now filled the ranch house with their energy and laughter, represented Elena's greatest source of pride and hope for the future. Each child showed evidence of the values that had shaped their parents and grandparents: respect for honest work, concern for those less fortunate, commitment to family and community, and the kind of moral courage that enabled people to stand up for their principles even when doing so required significant sacrifice. Maria's children, in particular, seemed to have inherited Elena's gift for teaching and Sam's natural leadership abilities. The oldest, now 8, already showed signs of the intelligence and determination that would enable him to make his own mark on the world while remaining grounded in the solid foundation that multiple generations had worked to establish. Elena's current pregnancy, her 6th and likely her last, had been a surprise that brought joy mixed with concern about the challenges of bearing children at her age. But Rose's experienced assessment had been reassuring, and Elena felt strong and confident about the coming birth. Sam's protective instincts had intensified with each passing year, and his worry about this pregnancy was tempered only by his complete faith in Elena's strength and Rose's skill. The question of names for the coming child had become a family project, with suggestions ranging from the traditional to the whimsical as everyone tried to find the perfect designation for this unexpected addition to an already complete family. Elena favored names that honored the family's heritage and the people who had shaped their story, while Sam leaned toward choices that reflected hope for the future and the possibility of new adventures. Elena often spent quiet moments on the porch in the early morning or late evening, reflecting on the miraculous series of events that had transformed her life from one of potential tragedy into one of almost overwhelming blessing. The intervention that had seemed so dramatic and unlikely at the time now appeared to be part of a larger pattern that she was only beginning to understand as the years revealed connections and consequences that had not been apparent during the crisis itself. The approaching birth had prompted Elena to think more deeply about legacy and the responsibility that came with having been given so much happiness and success. She wanted to ensure that her children and grandchildren understood not just the material inheritance they would receive, but the values and relationships that had made that inheritance possible. Wealth without wisdom was dangerous, and influence without integrity was corrupting. Sam's love letters, written during the brief periods when business had required him to travel away from the ranch, had become treasured family documents that revealed the depth of feeling that continued to animate their marriage even after decades of shared experience. Elena kept these letters in a special box, intending someday to share them with her daughters and granddaughters as examples of what true partnership could achieve when both people remained committed to each other's growth and happiness. The labor began during a thunderstorm that reminded Elena of the dramatic weather that had characterized so many of the important moments in her life. The timing seemed appropriate for this final chapter in her childbearing years, as if nature itself was providing a suitable backdrop for the completion of her family. The children and grandchildren gathered in the main room of the house, their excitement and anticipation creating an atmosphere of celebration rather than anxiety. Rosa arrived with her usual calm competence, her presence immediately reassuring everyone that this birth would proceed as smoothly as all the others despite Elena's age and the dramatic weather outside. Sam's nervousness had not diminished with experience, and he found himself pacing the halls and checking repeatedly on preparations that had been completed hours earlier. The birth itself proved to be Elena's easiest, as if her body had finally perfected the process after years of practice. The baby arrived during a lull in the storm, her first cries coinciding with the emergence of stars in the clearing sky. Sam's joy at holding his newest daughter was matched only by his profound relief that Elena had come through the birth safely, completing their family with this perfect final addition. They named the baby Hope Elena, a choice that reflected both their gratitude for the unexpected gift of this late pregnancy and their confidence in the future that awaited not just their own family, but the entire community they had helped to build. The newest Garrett would grow up in a world of security and love, surrounded by siblings and cousins who would ensure that she never doubted her worth or her place in the family constellation. Elena's recovery was swift and complete, her strong constitution serving her well even in this final pregnancy. The addition of hope to the family dynamics created new patterns and relationships, with the older children taking pride in their roles as protectors and teachers for their baby sister. The ranch routine accommodated the newest members seamlessly, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that had become hallmarks of the Garrett family approach to life's constant changes. The christening of Hope Elena became the largest celebration in the valley's history, with neighbors traveling from hundreds of miles away to witness the ceremony and participate in the festivities that followed. Father Miguel's successor performed the service with obvious pleasure, his blessing encompassing not just the baby, but the entire legacy of love and service that the Garrett family represented to the broader community. As Elena stood once again in St. Mary's Chapel, this time holding her youngest child while surrounded by the 5 children and multiple grandchildren who had blessed her marriage to Sam, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived according to her deepest values and highest aspirations. The journey from that terrifying wedding day to this moment of perfect contentment had required courage, determination, and faith, but it had led to blessings beyond anything she could have imagined during her darkest hours. Sam's arms around her family felt as strong and protective as they had during their first embrace, but now they carried the additional weight of proven devotion and shared triumph over every challenge that life had presented. His love had provided the foundation for everything good that had followed, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that their partnership would continue to bless their children and grandchildren for generations to come. The evening of the christening found Elena and Sam on their familiar spot on the front porch, watching their children and grandchildren play in the yard, while Hope slept peacefully in Elena's arms. The sounds of family life surrounded them like a symphony of contentment, and the future stretched ahead filled with promise and possibility. Elena reflected on the amazing truth that what had begun as an act of desperate courage had evolved into a love story that had touched countless lives and created a legacy that would endure long after she and Sam were gone. Their children would carry forward the values they had learned. Their grandchildren would benefit from the security and opportunities that had been created through decades of hard work and wise choices, and the community they had helped to build would continue to serve as an example of what could be achieved when people chose cooperation over conflict and service over selfishness. The stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, each point of light a reminder of the infinite possibilities that awaited those who had the courage to choose love over fear and hope over despair. Elena's journey from frightened bride to confident matriarch had proven that even the most desperate circumstances could become the foundation for extraordinary happiness when faced with determination and supported by genuine love. Sam's declaration from their wedding day that she would bear his sons had been transformed by time and experience into something far more profound than either of them had understood at the moment. She had indeed borne his children, but more importantly, she had helped him build a legacy of love and service that would influence countless future generations in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The story of the giant cowboy who had saved the frightened bride would be told and retold for generations. But for Elena and Sam, it remained simply the beginning of a love that had grown stronger with each passing year and had created ripples of blessing that extended far beyond their own family to encompass an entire community built on the foundation of their shared values and unwavering commitment to each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.